Today I'm going to create a mixed media canvas and I'm working on a 20 by 30 centimeter canvas board. To begin with, I'm adding some gesso to the canvas. It did come pre-gessoed, but I do like to add an extra layer to that. And then I'm beginning to add my paint, which is a golden fluid acrylic. This is turquoise phthalo. Now I'm going to add some acrylic glazing medium to the paint. This is going to allow me to have a gradient of colour going from dark at the very top of the canvas and lighter towards the base of the canvas. Here I'm using a tissue to take off some of the colour towards the base so that it becomes even lighter. And now I'm adding some darker still colour at the top. I'm using carbon black, which is a golden fluid acrylic. You need to use this colour quite sparingly. Black can be quite harsh. So I add some and then I use a baby wipe to drag it down the canvas so that this colour again becomes part of the gradient. Now I'm using some Liquitex ink in Turquoise Deep. This is an acrylic based ink, so it is permanent once it dries, and I'm using this to add some drips down the canvas. Next, I've taken some old book page and torn it into pieces, and I'm using some golden matte medium to adhere this onto the canvas. The reason I'm doing this is to add some extra interest onto the background, and it also provides some contrasting colour. Now I've chosen a pan pastel in black, and I'm using one of the pan pastel soft tools to outline the old book page and allow the torn edges to pick up that colour. Next, I decide that the actual text itself stands out a little bit too much for a background element, so I'm using some titanium white, blending it into the pieces of paper using my fingers just to allow that text to be driven back into the background more than it was. Now I'm using a Tim Holtz die. This is the Tattered Florals, and from this I have cut out two of the large daisy shapes. On one of them I've cut some of the petals off so that it looks like it is seen from a different viewpoint, and I've used matte medium again to adhere these daisy shapes to the page. And you might notice also that off camera I penciled in some stems for these flowers. To continue adding interest into the background, I've chosen a text stamp, and I'm using archival ink in aquamarine to stamp this onto the background. Most of it's only going to show towards the bottom of the page where it's lighter, but I've chosen the aquamarine colour to keep it monochromatic. Since whilst I was stamping the background some of the text went onto the daisy flowers and I didn't especially want that there, I'm just going over the flowers with some titanium white by golden, and this doesn't get rid of it totally, but it does send it further into the background. so I was more than happy with that, since I was painting over these anyway with another colour. Now I decide that I want to add some shadows around the daisies, so I'm using the pan pastel in black again along with the soft tool, and some of it does get onto the petals, so you might think it was a bit of a waste of time me painting them with the titanium white, but it's only a small amount. Now I've chosen a Crafters Workshop stencil. This is the mini cubist, and I'm using this along with some Liquitex modelling paste to add some texture into the background. Once the modelling paste is dry, I'm going to paint the daisies. So I've chosen Lumiere paint in pearlescent white, and this needs 2 to 3 coats really. It's not a particularly opaque paint, but it does have a really nice pearlescent finish, so it is worth the effort. Now I'm going to paint the centre of the flowers. I'm using a combination of a silks acrylic with a golden fluid acrylic. So the silks is the yellow rose colour, and this has a shimmer finish, and the golden fluid acrylic is quinacridone nicolazo gold. Now I'm going back to the pearlescent white Lumiere paint, and I'm going to paint over the texture paste. The textured part of the canvas is not going to remain this colour. This is a base coat, and the reason I'm using it is because it has the shimmer finish to it, and I'm going to paint over the top of it with a flat colour, but the pearlescence of this paint will show through, so that is the reason for base coating it. And I also painted the flower stems in the same pearlescent white colour. Now I'm taking the turquoise phthalo fluid acrylic that I used at the beginning on the canvas background, and I'm going over the pearlescent white base coat, and I do this quite lightly at first, but I do go back and do a second coat to make it a little bit darker. Now I'm taking a Micron pen by Sakura, and I'm using this to add some detail to the flowers, and I also use it on the flower stems. This is just going to add some definition to the daisies and lift them a little bit from the background. Next, I've taken some of the flower petals that I cut off one of the daisies, and I'm adding some Lumiere paint to these, and I'm going to add them to the canvas as though they are petals that have fallen from the daisies that are already on there. Once those petals are dry, I position them on the canvas where I'd like them, and I use golden matte medium to adhere them down. This is the text that I'm going to add to my canvas, and I've printed this using my label maker. It has a self-adhesive backing, so I've used that to attach it to the canvas, but I'm reinforcing it with some golden matte medium, and this will also change the surface from glossy to matte, which will match the rest of the canvas, and it also gives a surface that can be painted. And now I'm using a micron pen to outline the falling petals in the same manner as the other daisies. Now I'm adding colour to the text. I'm using exactly the same colours that we used for the flower centres, so there is a mixture of the silks paint as well as the golden fluid acrylic. This is carbon black golden fluid acrylic, and I'm using this with a piece of Ranger cut and dry foam to sponge around the edges and create a frame. And as a final touch to the canvas, I'm outlining the text with a Posca paint pen in black. And off camera I also add some shadows using pan pastel black to the falling petals. And that is the end of today's project. I hope you enjoyed watching. As usual, there will be a link to the full product list in the video description box, as well as my social media links.